We begin with the brutal end. Imagine a time when the scales of justice finally tipped, and those who had once brought pain and terror were forced to face a punishment as harsh as the crimes they committed. It is hard to imagine, but hanging was the method chosen to end their lives after the war, a method that underscored the severity of their actions. No mercy for the merciless. On July 4, 1946, at the Stutthof concentration camp near Gdansk, Poland, a public execution took place. Hundreds of people gathered on Biskupia Gorka, a hill that would forever be marked by sorrow and justice. On that day, Wanda Klaff, one of the most infamous guards, was hanged in front of a crowd that could not ignore the weight of the past. This was not just about one person, it was about sending a clear message. In total, at least 7 of these notorious female guards, including names like Irma Gracie and Elizabeth Volkenrath, were executed by hanging in the years following the war. These dates and numbers are more than just facts. They remind us of the lives shattered and the memories that still haunt survivors and their families. For example, Irma Gracie, often called the Beast of Belsen, was hanged on December 13, 1945, a date that echoes the immense loss and suffering experienced by thousands of innocent victims. Similarly, Elizabeth Volkenrath, known for her brutal role at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, was also executed by hanging, sealing the fate of those who had once wielded power over life and death. I find it both chilling and deeply saddening that even the lowest-ranking roles in such a horrific machine could lead to responsibility for mass murder. Yet, these executions remind us that history does not let such cruelty fade away without consequence. Wanda Klaff's story is one that shakes the soul. On July 4, 1946, at Stutthof concentration camp near Gdansk, Poland, Wanda Klaff was publicly executed by hanging, a moment that marked a grim turning point in the quest for justice after the war. Imagine standing on Biskupia Gorka, the hill overlooking Stutthof, and witnessing the final act of punishment for a person whose actions had brought unimaginable suffering to countless innocent lives. Wanda Klaff was not just a name among many. She was a symbol of the cruelty that existed within the Nazi concentration camp system. As a female guard at Stutthof, she played a direct role in the daily torture and murder of prisoners. Records show that Stutthof, which was established in 1939, became one of the last concentration camps to be liberated. By the time the Allies arrived, thousands had suffered within its barbed wire fences. For many survivors, the mere sight of Stutthof's grim grounds recalled endless nights of fear and despair. Her execution on that fateful July day was not a quiet affair. It was a public event, intended to send a powerful message. No matter the rank or the gender, those who partook in such inhuman acts would be held accountable. On that day, hundreds gathered, and the atmosphere was heavy with the memories of lost loved ones and the echoes of the atrocities committed there. The date itself, July 4th, a day often associated with freedom and independence in other parts of the world, was bitterly ironic. In Poland and across Europe, however, it marked a day when retribution for evil actions was finally carried out. It is important to remember that Wanda Klaff's trial and subsequent execution came after years of painstaking investigation and judicial process. Survivors, whose lives had been shattered, had provided detailed accounts of the horrors they faced daily. They described how guards like Klaff would treat prisoners with extreme brutality, sometimes using tools that were anything but humane. For instance, some survivors recalled how guards would force prisoners into exhausting labor under impossible conditions, only to punish any sign of weakness with violence. The chilling details of these testimonies, recorded during the Stutthof trials, provided clear evidence of the systematic cruelty perpetrated by individuals like Klaff. The Beast of Belsen, Irma Gracie was known by many as the Beast of Belsen, and her name became a byword for the extreme cruelty that occurred in Nazi concentration camps. Her actions during the war left an indelible mark of terror on countless survivors, and it was these actions that led to her being sentenced to death. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Survivors testified that she used brutal methods, beating prisoners with whips, shouting hateful orders, and even directly causing death through her violent behavior. These acts were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic pattern of abuse that helped make life a daily nightmare for the victims at camps like Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. The trial against Gries was one of the first major war crimes trials after the end of World War II. During the Belsen trial, prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence: eyewitness accounts, documented orders, and physical evidence that showed how her actions contributed directly to the suffering and death of thousands of innocent people. It became clear in court that Gries was not merely following orders, but that she had taken a personal and active role in the execution of these inhumane policies. Her behavior was deemed so atrocious that the court had no choice but to hold her fully accountable for her crimes. On December 13, 1945, the sentence was carried out at Hamelin Prison in Allied-occupied Germany. The method of execution was hanging, a punishment chosen for its finality and symbolic message that justice would be served, no matter how long it took. British executioner Albert Pierrepoint, a man who had overseen many such executions during the post-war period, was responsible for carrying out the sentence. The execution was done using the short drop method, which is designed to quickly break the neck and end life without prolonged suffering. Every detail of the process was calculated. The noose was carefully measured, the platform set up, and the moment of finality marked by a strict adherence to procedure. For many people watching from a distance, the hanging of Irma Gries on that cold December day was more than just the end of one life. It was a moment of catharsis. It symbolized the dismantling of a machine of terror that had caused unspeakable suffering. The execution sent a powerful message. No matter the rank or role, even someone as notorious as Gries, those who committed such horrific crimes would eventually be held responsible. Even decades later, the story of Irma Gries's trial and hanging continues to serve as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked cruelty. Her fate shows us that history remembers, and that those who participate in atrocities are not allowed to escape accountability. It is a chilling example of how justice was meted out in the aftermath of one of the darkest periods in human history. Their final moments were as merciless as the suffering they had inflicted, a grim testament to the weight of their crimes. Justice was served, but the scars of history remain, reminding us of the depths of human cruelty. Let us ensure these stories are never forgotten. Like, share, and subscribe for more insights into history's darkest chapters. The infamy and end of Ilse Koch. Ilse Koch remains one of the most infamous figures among the female perpetrators of Nazi atrocities, and her post-war fate has been the subject of much debate and controversy. Although many popular accounts simplify her story by stating that she was sentenced to death but committed suicide in prison, the full narrative is more complex and reveals much about the post-war judicial process and the legacy of Nazi crimes. After World War II, Ilse Koch was arrested and tried for her involvement in the brutal treatment of prisoners at several concentration camps, most notably at Buchenwald. During her trial, she was convicted of crimes against humanity for the atrocities committed under her watch. In 1947, a military tribunal sentenced her to death. However, in the immediate post-war period, Allied authorities were frequently revisiting sentences as part of wider debates over justice, retribution, and political considerations in a devastated Europe. In Koch's case, her death sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment by a U.S. military court in 1948. Ilse Koch was then transferred to a German prison. Over the following years, her incarceration became a symbol of both the failure to fully close the chapter on Nazi crimes and the unresolved emotions surrounding her actions. By the mid-1960s, as public interest in the war crimes trials had waxed and waned, Koch's continued presence in prison made her a potent figure for many. In 1967, while imprisoned in Aichach Women's Prison in Bavaria, Ilse Koch took her own life. Most accounts indicate that she committed suicide by hanging, a method that, in a grim twist, echoed the fate meted out to many other Nazi war criminals. Although the precise details of her final moments remain somewhat murky, due in part to the secretive nature of prison records and differing testimonies, the broadly accepted narrative is that her suicide ended her long incarceration, closing a final chapter on a life marked by unspeakable cruelty. It is worth noting that some historians and researchers emphasize that the commutation of her sentence and her subsequent suicide also illustrate the complicated nature of post-war justice. On one hand, her death sentence was seen by many survivors as long overdue. On the other, the decision to commute her sentence reflected the shifting political and legal landscape of post-war Germany and the Allied occupation. Ilse Koch's suicide in 1967 has thus become a potent, if tragic, symbol of the unresolved legacy of Nazi atrocities, a stark reminder that, even decades after the war, the scars of those events remained deep and contentious. The dark path of Greta Bösel. Greta Bösel's life remains a disturbing study in the perversion of care into cruelty. Originally trained as a nurse, a profession devoted to healing and compassion, Bösel's transformation into a concentration camp overseer stands as a stark example of how the machinery of Nazi terror could corrupt even those with backgrounds in the caring professions. Once a nurse, Bösel was recruited into the SS during a time when the regime was desperate for personnel to fill positions in its rapidly expanding concentration camp system. At Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp in northern Germany, Bösel quickly shed any vestiges of her former vocation. Instead of administering care to those in need, she became notorious for her brutal treatment of inmates. Eyewitness testimonies from survivors paint a picture of a woman who ruthlessly used her position of authority to inflict physical and psychological pain. Bösel's cruelty was not limited to a few isolated incidents. It was part of a systematic campaign of abuse. She was directly implicated in the severe mistreatment of prisoners. Allegations include subjecting detainees to beatings, kicking them, and using her physical presence and authority to enforce a regime of terror. The transformation from nurse to overseer was complete when she began using methods and instruments of punishment that were antithetical to the healing arts. Reports from the post-war trials described how she would not hesitate to administer violent blows to inmates who were already weakened by starvation, disease, and the harsh conditions of camp life. Her actions contributed to an environment where the prisoners' suffering was routine and merciless. At the Hamburg Ravensbrück trials, a series of post-war military tribunals aimed at bringing Nazi perpetrators to justice, Bösel was found guilty of war crimes for her direct participation in the abuse and dehumanization of camp inmates. The evidence presented in court detailed not only her frequent physical assaults, but also her role in the selection process, where she helped determine which prisoners would face further brutal treatment or even death. Her actions were emblematic of a broader pattern of cruelty that characterized the behavior of many camp overseers. But what made Bösel's case particularly chilling was the irony that someone trained in a profession meant to heal could so completely embrace and execute a policy of systematic brutality. Her execution by hanging on May 3, 1947, was carried out by the notorious British hangman Albert Pierrepoint at Hamelin Prison. This grim fate underscored the fact that no one, regardless of a past in a caring field, was immune from accountability when they chose to perpetrate evil. Greta Bösel's story is a reminder that the choices individuals make in times of extreme moral crisis can lead to the transformation of compassion into unspeakable cruelty, and that such choices carry a heavy price in the eyes of history and justice. Elisabeth Falkenrath's journey to the gallows. Elisabeth Falkenrath's career in the Nazi concentration camp system remains one of the starkest reminders of the extreme cruelty that was systematically imposed on millions of prisoners. Serving first at Auschwitz and later at Bergen-Belsen, Falkenrath held a senior supervisory role where she not only participated in, but actively contributed to, the brutal regime that dehumanized and exterminated countless innocent lives. Testimonies from survivors and detailed records from the post-war trials reveal that she was deeply involved in the selection process for the gas chambers and in enforcing harsh disciplinary measures that left prisoners physically and psychologically scarred. At Auschwitz, where the machinery of mass murder was at its most efficient, Falkenrath was part of the cadre of overseers responsible for the daily operations that led to the systematic killing of inmates. Her actions were not isolated incidents. They were part of a deliberate, state-sanctioned process of terror. She was notorious for her callousness. Witnesses described her as being indifferent to the suffering of the prisoners, frequently ordering beatings and other forms of physical abuse without hesitation. When the camp at Auschwitz was closed, she was transferred to Bergen-Belsen, another site where the conditions were appalling, and death was an everyday reality. The trial that led to her conviction was part of the broader effort by Allied forces to bring Nazi perpetrators to justice. The evidence against Völkenrath was overwhelming. Survivors provided harrowing accounts of her inhumane conduct, and official documents detailed her participation in decisions that directly led to the deaths of many. For her crimes against humanity, she was sentenced to death, a verdict that underscored the world's determination to hold accountable those who had contributed to one of the darkest chapters in human history. Her execution by hanging on December 13, 1945, at Hamelin Prison, carried out by the noted British executioner Albert Pierrepoint, marked a grim closing of this dark chapter. Völkenrath's death was not merely a punitive measure, it was a powerful symbolic act, representing the end of a regime of unspeakable cruelty and a clear denunciation of the perversion of power that allowed such atrocities to occur. Her fate serves as a lasting reminder that even those who wielded authority in the service of inhumanity would eventually be held accountable for their actions. The brutal executions. The execution was not a quiet, formal procedure. It was a raw, brutal spectacle designed to match the gravity of the crimes committed. In the immediate aftermath of the war, when justice was being exacted on those who had perpetrated unspeakable acts, the method chosen was often the short drop hanging. This method, used by the notorious British executioner Albert Pierrepoint at sites like Hamelin Prison, was intended to break the condemned's neck with a sudden, violent jolt. The procedure was precise and harsh. The prisoner was forced to stand on a trapdoor with a noose tightly adjusted around their neck, and in a split second the trapdoor was released, sending the body crashing downward. In many accounts, witnesses described a sickening snap, an audible, almost visceral confirmation that the condemned's neck had been broken. Public executions such as these were carried out in view of onlookers, including Allied soldiers and a few courageous survivors, whose shocked silence testified to the raw brutality of the act. The process was deliberately rough and unforgiving. The condemned did not receive any semblance of mercy. Instead, every detail of the execution was designed to be as violent as the cruelty they had inflicted upon others. The executioners worked with ruthless efficiency, ensuring that the moment of death was both swift and undeniably violent. Records from the post-war trials paint a vivid picture of this final punishment. For instance, at the Hamburg Ravensbrück trials, several female guards, whose own acts of terror had reduced countless innocent lives to rubble, met their end through hanging. These executions were meticulously organized. The condemned were often paraded to the gallows, their faces marked by resignation, or, in some cases, defiant contempt, before the fatal drop occurred. The physical impact, the snapping of the vertebrae, the rapid, violent collapse of the body, served as a grim counterbalance to the previously unleashed brutality within the concentration camps. It was a moment that forced even the most hardened onlookers to confront the reality of absolute retribution. The execution was more than a punitive measure. It was a symbolic closing of a dark chapter in history. The rough and savage manner in which these sentences were carried out was a direct physical manifestation of the moral outrage felt by a world determined to end the reign of terror. As the condemned bodies hung from the gallows, every detail of that violent end, every drop, every snap, reminded the world that the capacity for cruelty would always be met with a response that was as harsh as it was final. This public, brutal act of retribution left an indelible mark on history, a stark reminder that no one, regardless of their background or former profession, could escape the consequences of unleashing inhumanity. The brutal executions of these female Nazi guards serve as a chilling reminder that justice, though delayed, was ultimately delivered. Their fates were sealed by the very cruelty they inflicted on others, proving that no evil goes unanswered. History will never forget the horrors they orchestrated, or the reckoning that followed. Let us remember the past, so that such darkness never rises again. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories from history.